once the human right to life has been deleted, well then they're not going to be long coming after other really important human rights in our society. And I'm going to talk about those in a couple of minutes. But I remember being on radio shows over the last couple of years and talking about the right to life, and radio presenters saying, listen, Peadar, that issue's over. That's over. That's done and dusted. Abortion's been settled in this country. But that's not the case. It's not the case in either direction. Because what we're seeing at the moment is, we're actually seeing the pro-abortion campaigners pushing for ever more access to abortion currently. Now, you know, we live in a strange political time at the moment where some political parties virtue signal by trying to outdo each other in showing that they're more in favour of more access to abortion. So we've had this particular review that's been carried out by the state over the last number of years, and I have never seen such a whitewash in all my life of a review that was put together by this government. The first and probably most, I suppose, newsworthy element of the review that it sought to delete the 3-day waiting period. Now, the issue of an abortion is a horrendously big decision. You cannot reverse an abortion. You cannot bring a child back to life. The idea of having a 3-day wait period to consider the enormity of that decision should be very obvious to anybody. You wouldn't buy a house or a car, most likely, without thinking about that particular decision for at least 3 days. And yet, this review panel, commissioned by the government, decided to delete that element. They did so without speaking to one woman, one of the 4,000 women who so far attended the first abortion meeting and did not attend the second. That means because of the 3-day wait period, 4,000 mothers are at home with their children at the moment. Their children are at the dinner table currently. Now, if you were to review that issue or analyse that issue, surely you'd make one phone call. You'd send one email. You'd have one conversation with at least one of those women who changed their minds in that 3-day waiting period. But not one was done. And that, for me, underlined the whitewash nature of that particular report. An incredible thing. Secondly, they didn't talk to one mother who has suffered an adverse incident in terms of the abortions that have happened in Ireland over the last 3 years. So we know that hundreds of women are suing the state currently for adverse incidents, things that have gone seriously wrong either to them or their child during those abortions over that period of time. I've been on the news and I've raised it in the Dáil, and I know Senator Ronan Mullins here has also raised it in the Shannon a number of times, of the issue of baby Christopher. So baby Christopher was a fully healthy unborn child. His mother was told that that child had no chance of survival, that child had what they call a fatal fetal abnormality. And that child was aborted at 15 weeks. So a late-term abortion. And the hospital tried to cover it up, tried not to tell the mother about what happened afterwards, and the mother found out that baby Christopher was a fully healthy child. A fully healthy child. And yet, that mother was not contacted by the reviewer of that abortion review, and was not none of the women who suffered adverse effects were contacted. Now, how could you review the current legislation and so-called service when not talking to anybody who has suffered as a result of it? Absolutely mind-blowing stuff. And the third element, and this was an issue that was risen in the committee when we questioned the author of that review. The third element was she believed that no doctor should be employed in the health service, especially in those services that may be asked to carry out an abortion, if they're not willing to carry out an abortion, or no nurse or no other medical individual. So, in other words, she felt that if you were pro-life, if you were for human rights, that you should be discriminated against in terms of employment into the health service. Now, how crazy is this, given it's virtually impossible to get a doctor at the moment? I know plenty of people can't get onto doctors' lists. I know people who are ringing doctors and can't get to speak to a doctor for maybe 2 weeks. There is 700 consultants missing from the health service. There's 1 million people on hospital waiting lists. And so tunnel-visioned are these abortion campaigners that none of that seems to matter. they think they should refuse doctors and nurses who want to work in the health system if they are pro-life. It simply does not make sense at all. And the government are looking to go further in this. They have introduced a bill that they call the Safe Zones Bill. And what it is actually is a censorship bill. You know, I have come to the view that this government is one of the most authoritarian governments in the history of the state, in the directions that they're going at the moment. This so-called Safe Zone Bill will actually make no-go areas for people who support the human rights to life, many parts of the country. If you look at Dublin, there are so many of these that it makes virtually impossible for a human rights campaign, a pro-life campaign, to march down O'Connell Street to support the rights to life. Now, you could march down O'Connell Street to support the right for abortion, but you couldn't march down O'Connell Street to support the rights to life. So some political views will be legally entitled to be articulated in the public realm, but other political views simply won't. They will be banned. And that, again, is the opposite to what a liberal democracy is. We aim to very strongly believe that we, as a society, need to be able to articulate our views openly and respectfully. That actually the engine of a democracy is the competition of ideas. It's where both sides are able to engage with each other about what they believe is the right thing to do. And if you have a proper competition of ideas in terms of democracy, the people will be able to see what ideas are the best, and those ideas will percolate up to become the policy of the government and will be implemented in society. But in this situation, certain views are going to be banned in certain areas. And anybody that's having a look at what's happening in England will see that you have people praying silently outside abortion clinics. And we have police officers coming to them and asking them what they're doing and what they're thinking. And they say, well, I'm praying. And they'll say, well, what are you praying about? And they'll say, well, I'm praying about abortion. And they'll say, okay, well then you're arrested. Now, the idea that you could have a police officer, potentially a Garda in Ireland, who is forced to ask an individual what they're thinking about in a particular area, or if they're praying on what particular reason, again, is incredibly invasive on a democratic basis and is incredibly authoritarian. And actually, it matches the government's travel in terms of the hate speech bill, in a situation where the government created a hate speech bill which they won't define what hate is, for a start, and secondly, they won't define what gender is. Now, I always say that if you asked a kid to define something and they couldn't define it, well, you could accept that. But how can you accept a criminal bill that could put you in jail that won't define elements such as that, which is incredible. So you have all of this use of the Gardaí for these ideological reasons, while at the same time, in real life, you have people in towns and villages and cities across Ireland who can't get a Garda when there's a serious crime happening, when there's burglaries happening in their homes, when people are being attacked and mugged and beaten up on the streets. It's like this government does not understand that there are real people. The government is just focusing on the NGOs, they're focusing on the Irish Times and the RTE, and after that, the issues that are affecting real people are being ignored at the moment. And that's an absolute disgrace as far as I'm concerned. So, in my view, we have a moral obligation to stand against this direction of travel from the government politically, and we also have a moral obligation to get active in terms of the rights to life. I listened to Linda about what people can do, and I want to say, what I believe that people can do as well. We founded AIM2 4.5 years ago, and the reason we founded AIM2 was because there was no political party in the South who unequivocally stood up for the human rights to life anymore. And it seems to us that members of other political parties who say that they're pro-life may be at the door were silent in terms of campaigning for this issue anymore. So they'd tell you on the streets if you asked them, but they wouldn't use their time in the Dáil. They wouldn't use their time on radio or television to fight for this human right anymore. They have been, in the main, silenced. So we set up this organisation. Thankfully, it's got councillors across the country at the moment. Councillor Sarah O'Reilly is a councillor here in Cavan. We have 1,400 members, and I will tell you, I believe solidly it is the most important political movement that we have in this country. And we have a large number of really good candidates now in place right across the state. People like Gráinne McPhillips, who's in the audience here today. There's a local election happening next May, June, and a European election happening as well. And I thoroughly believe that the more votes that are cast in every single ballot box across the country for Aontú will put the fear of God into the government parties, into Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and the Greens, who are driving this current policy at the moment. And, you know, I remember when Homer Simpson stood for mayor a number of years ago on that cartoon, and his particular motto at the time was, "Why can't somebody else do it?" Okay? Now, if you say to yourself, well, I'd love to see Aontú do well, but I'm not necessarily going to get involved or help. If your attitude is, why can't somebody else do it? Well then, the chances are we're simply not going to get the energy that's necessary. And, you know, Gráinne McPhillips has application forms in her hands there today, so I really encourage people who have an interest to go to Gráinne and sign up membership of this great organisation. Because if we can get Gráinne elected, Sarah elected in County Cavan, and people right across Ireland, we will have people who are ready to stand in the general election in the months afterwards. And then we will have voices in the Dáil to push back against what's happening in this country. And you know, one of the things I will say is there are also many good independent pro-lifers in the country as well, and I don't want to hog this pitch just for ourselves. People like Senator Ronan Mullins are doing tremendous work in the Shannon and elsewhere on this. The last point I wanted to leave with you before I finish is, one of the big issues that I've noticed as an elected representative and an activist for many years is that people often have their head down. And when you have your head down, you will achieve nothing. We are heartbroken that the 8th has fallen. But if we keep our head down, we will not be able to reverse the damage that has happened. We need to raise our heads high again. And the other issue is, the people have the power. You have the power. There's no elected representative in this country that has power only because you've given it to them. And the fact that you have the power is an enormous thing. And I want you to use that power as best you can in political activism, amongst your friends and family, in backing such a great organisation as this group here today. But don't allow your heads to fall. For this human rights fight that we have in our hand is the most important human rights fight of a generation. And I leave you just with the words of Martin Luther King on this, and some people, you know, will have heard of this before. I thoroughly believe that the arc of justice, the arc of history, bends towards justice. And I firmly believe that good people like yourselves get involved in this movement, we can achieve that justice in our lifetime. Gur míle maith agaibh go léir.